keep finding ways that we're helping partners finding either, balance in their life or focus or purpose.
Practices that are going to help improve your project management skills or your finances.
We're here to talk about setting long-term goals and then how to achieve them.
Increasing your quality, therefore becoming the best place in town to work.
Welcome to Academy Live. Welcome back to Academy Live. Today I have the opportunity to go one-on-one with Chris Johnson with CompTIA. Today we're going to be discussing navigating risk management. Ooh, fun. I guarantee we'll make it fun though, but it'll be very informational, be very valuable. So I'm really looking forward to this opportunity. So let's bring on Chris Johnson. Chris, how you doing today? Good to see you, my friend.
Hey, good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, glad to have you here. I'm not sure if I talked you into it or if you volunteered, but either way, here you are. So those people that are tuning in or checking us out, give us a little, we like to call it a humble brag. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a Leo, and I like long walks on the beach, preferably when it's not hot. That should pretty much sum up me. In my job role at CompTIA, I have the privilege of running compliance programs under the cybersecurity team with Wayne Selk and my teammates, Lisa Person and Miles Jobjan. And so I mean, you know me, Chris, I've been involved with CompTIA since before I was an employee. So I've been here now 2 years, and my big reveal, if you will, on this show is that I get to be sort of facilitating the CompTIA Cybersecurity Trust Mark, which is a framework or a standard that's designed specifically for solution providers. And while it's been around throughout the ages of IT, it actually was originally launched back in 2008. We relaunched it in 2022. And this time around, we said, we need to make sure this is specific to solution providers. We want it to be something that is obtainable without hiring lots of resources to pull it off. And we want to make sure that when they're talking to their clients, when they're talking to their insurance companies, that they can actually, prove or provide evidence that would say, hey, as an insurance company, I think I want to insure this MSP because I'm looking at what they're doing and it makes sense. So that's kind of where we're at. We're now roughly a year and a half into the program. We've got about 220 or so MSPs participating. We've got about a dozen that have gone through and achieved the new trust mark. And it's just continuing to grow and expand globally. In fact, I just came back from Australia where we had a chance to share our risk management workshop, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, with a group of about 55 MSPs. And I will just say this. I know everybody knows how the word risk works and what it's for and what it often implies, but I was quite surprised at how few MSPs were actually talking about risk of any kind internally or with their clients. So I could say that's me in a nutshell.
Well, first of all, the Leo part surprised me. The long walks on the beach did not. But I love what you're doing. The trust mark, like you said, we've talked about this. It's been around. But the purpose of it and how it's kind of executed now, to me, is I'm really excited. I want to touch base on that a little bit more. But before, I'm going to do a quick diversion. So, obviously you've been, evangelizing about security. You've been helping, partners and service providers address security things. But tell me a little bit about your journey to get there and your knowledge and experience and background in security. Was this something that 5-year-old Chris Johnson was saying, boy, I can't wait to get up and be a cybersecurity, evangelist? Like, tell me a little bit about your path to get where you're at now.
Man, 5-year-old me, I think I'm pretty confident most of us were like, I'm gonna be a fireman. That was like, I mean, I didn't have and I was probably evangelizing that out of my treehouse at the time. So
some things
I don't know that we have time on this episode to talk through from 5-year-old me to now. But if I was to go back a little bit on my career path relevant to today, I would say that it was really the MSP journey that most MSPs go on. Hey, I'm going to do this better than the company that I'm working for, right? We almost all MSPs at some point in time made a decision. Either they were working for an MSP or they were doing something in a different space, and they said, "I want to go do this." That's a pretty common trend emerging that we've seen, and I think it still is today. So that was, I won't even go back too far on when that happened. But one of the things that, like many MSPs, when you start out, you kind of take whatever you can get from a client standpoint. There wasn't a lot of, well, we really didn't even call ourselves MSPs then, right? Like it was, we were providing IT services, whether it was on some sort of break fix model, or maybe we were smart enough to figure out some sort of MRR where we basically were charging for time, right? So during that time, one of the things that we ran into after about 18 months of starting the MSP, back then we were Untangled Solutions, is what are we going to focus on? Like we can't do everything. We can't be the jack of all trades and master of little to nothing. So we ended up where we were at in California. Healthcare was a huge demand for implementing certain infrastructure. So that's kind of what we targeted. We said, hey, we're going to standardize on this. Well, if I'd have known then what I know now, I might have potentially chosen a different path, because compliance and mapping to standards and trying to achieve success around things that are regulated and there's governance for, it's not the most glamorous of things, but someone has to do it. And as I got into it and we did it more and more, what we found was when it's done well, you can actually measure and see that sort of glimmer of hope with a client or even internally to say, look, we achieved these things because we followed a set of standards. So that was kind of the turning point. We started to grow the MSP relatively fast, sold it, and then about 4 or 5 years later, I found myself going, I kind of want to get back into the IT space. I want to go back to where my MSP colleagues are. And post-COVID, CompTIA said, hey, I think we have a place for you. And as far as I can tell so far, best decision I've made.
That's awesome. And great journey. Yeah, I don't think getting from all the way from the 5-year-old to today, would probably a bit much, but I think that's a great picture you painted, which I think is also then a good segue into kinda talk about a little bit about this navigating risk. Tell us a little bit about this course, and tell us kinda the background behind it. Like, what's the backstory behind it? How did this get started, and
Sure.
what are we gonna talk about today?
Yeah, so the backstory is really Wayne Selk's story to tell. So he built this workshop out for MSPs participating in the Trustmark journey. And so it was part of a series of workshops that we collectively as a team began putting together. Wayne tackled risk management. Myself and Miles Jobgen, we tackled culture and strategy. Largely the focus of the workshop and the stuff therein was to help MSPs primarily in the governance arena. So if you look around at the landscape today, there's a lot of frameworks out there. Not very many of them that are popular focus on governance. And over time, I think even those behind those frameworks started recognizing, like, if you don't have some leadership and authority behind tackling these safeguards and controls, then it's really hard to be successful with them or measure success, where you have those participating going, hey, I know and I can see that we're doing this in our organization. So with that being said, we also found that technical people are really good at technical things. So that reinforced the necessity behind these workshops. And so you've seen this with NIST. So NIST just released their edition of governance. CIS just added 8.1 and articulated the necessity for governance. And so I think for the Trustmark, we felt reinforced or validated that governance is important. And so a big part of governance, a big part of mapping your organization to a set of standards is really about risk and risk management. And the catch is, if you don't understand your risks, then how are you going to manage them? And so this 5-part series is really about an organization being equipped with the tools. And the tools are not fancy, advanced, like, hey, you got to go subscribe to this platform and start defining your rocks, or get crazy with certain life goals about how you're going to go and achieve risk. A lot of this stuff's already defined for us. So using things like the CIS Top 18, doing some sort of gap analysis and identifying where your vulnerabilities are. Those are all part or pieces of risk management. The catch or the kicker here is with IT services is that we often do those things, but then don't use words like risk in the conversation with ourselves or with our clients. It's kind of this taboo word, like other four-letter words that we probably shouldn't say on this show. So if we jump into it, we can kind of go through the workshop at a very high level. Like I think in the time that we have, I think I can bring us to some like, hey, these are some good ideas to think about, and maybe give reason to why you should sign up for the workshop through PAX 8.
No, I think that would be great. Let's just jump into it and
Let's jump into it.
yeah,
So,
slides.
so let's talk about first and foremost, what is risk? So if I were to pull the slide up and talk to you about, what is risk? I mean, we all can probably, answer this question. Yeah, risk is the possibility that something bad is going to happen. And the thing that's interesting about this particular definition is if you look at 3, it talks about in the context or subject matter of an insurance contract, like the ability to have loss, and in most cases tied to some sort of financial loss. So what's interesting about that is that's a little bit different than I think what we probably would think of it. So as you go to the next slide, we talk about what Hartford actually says about this. Essentially, anything that could impact your company's finances. Well, I would argue that things like ransomware and natural disasters and any number of things are easy to go, yep, that would cause problems to my company's finances. But as we go through the course, and we'll obviously go through a couple of the things today, we're going to put time and energy into things like what are the different categories of risk that we need to think about. So like one of those might be something you've never thought about, like supply chain or global conflict, or I don't want to go into all of them. I don't want to give away the whole farm here, but in this module, what we want to talk about is inherent versus residual risk. So everybody kind of has a general idea. And Chris, maybe you can weigh in on this because I think it's important to have this conversation. And this is where we would take a deep dive with the participants of the class. And that is, what is inherent risk? And I'll ask you that, Chris. What's inherent risk?
Oh,
Dude, it's written on the slide.
Well, that's way too easy, right? Okay.
Okay, that's fair.
I was trying to be clever and say other than just reading out the amount of risks.
Sorry, I gave you too much rope.
But we're not using 4-letter words, so that's okay.
Right. Sorry.
No, but I think it's great to identify that, because I think it's sometimes when we talk about, I see this come up a lot in peer groups, and I think it's the things that we don't address. It's that we think about the obvious risks, the things where we have control over, the things we're implementing,
Right.
whether it's part of a framework or something.
Sure.
But we forget, I think, if a car is going down the road and there's a curve, if nobody's steering it and keeping it from going off, it's those things in the absence of, like you said, I love the word in the absence of control. And I think that's
Right.
a very underrated or appreciated area of risk.
Yeah, and I think if you're talking to any MSP, talking to their clients can have these conversations. Let's do asset inventory as an example. They're going to go do that, right? Like if they're prospecting a client, the last thing they're going to do is provide a proposal to said prospect that says, here's a quote for $1,000 a month for whatever services, because we did the math and we think you have roughly 25 assets, right? Like that's just not
right.
what we do, right? Like even though they might do a per user, there's all these new formulas for how you might price it. You want to know what you're getting yourself into. You want to know what they have, what the environment looks like. And some of the other things that might be present are things like, if I onboard this client and I haven't applied any controls yet, does other MSP stuff already exist in the environment that I'm inheriting? Have they been through an incident or had, some sort of major event, natural disaster, fill in the blank, that would require doing something to address for going forward so that it doesn't happen again. Like as you said, because I
Mhm.
didn't put my foot on the brakes or choose to steer, I ended up taking my car in a place that it wasn't intended to be taken because it has tires and, well, not wings, right?
Now that
So so that's the first part of really digging into the first module of the risk management. The second part of this same question, though, is then what is residual risk? So, Chris, what is residual risk? And you can't read it now because you already were given that the other time and you didn't use it.
I would think about things like, okay, so we've done the assessment. We know they've got, X number of computers, servers, equipment, things like the line of business app. We can look at
Yeah,
what's legacy. I think the risk could be something of you've got legacy systems, you've got outdated software, you need to do upgrades. It could be things around are in an industry that is governance or compliance. So there's risk around how are you keeping yourself compliant? Am I on track there? Now I'm
yeah.
starting to
In fact, I'd say you just go right to the next slide because I think you're really hitting on that kind of key point, which is if we look at what it means to go past this, going through residual risk, then the next step would be identifying risk. So if you go to identifying risk. What's interesting about this is we can take a framework, pick any technical framework. So like let's just say you pick NIST 800-171 or you did NIST version 2 or CSF version 2, you can start to see a pattern emerge where if I were to apply controls to my environment or any client environment, when I'm done, now what's left? And so this is the area where we obviously understand that the trust mark is about you need to go through the pattern. You need to look at what it means to identify and know what you're capable of doing today, the things that you can address today. But then let's look at it from a pure business perspective, not whether or not we have MFA, not whether or not we have good backups, but what are the things that could happen to our organization that would be problematic for us to continue operating as a business. And this is where I think a lot of organizations, not just MSPs, tend to fall down. And that is they do some brainstorming. Maybe they get really pessimistic and they do the whole the sky is falling type scenarios, skydiver jumping out of a plane is eaten by a shark that happened to jump out of the water at just the right time. But what's crazy about all of this is they don't talk to the employees. They're not having a conversation with their own organization to actually get the heartbeat of the things that they might not have a clue to. Like what happens around the water cooler? What are their fears? What keeps your staff up at night? And actually asking them to share that with the rest of the organization. Kind of like there's no theoretical scenario that might be a risk to your company as long as it's something that's realistic that could happen. And this is where we have a lot of deeper conversations around things like, well, what happens if you leave the basement window open and you have a torrential downpour? And it just so happens to be that basement is where all of the computers you're setting up for said hospital are being configured. And you come in the next morning to find instead of having, your lab, functioning and prepping for the hospital, you have a swimming pool full of floating objects. Not saying that happened, may or may not have happened to an MSP, I know. But this is just the beginning part of it, right? Those are scenarios that may happen or have happened, and you can use those to help articulate what it means to identify risk. Because if it's happened to someone else, obviously it can happen to you. When someone says, yeah, we'll never have tornadoes. Well, if you look at the weather patterns we've had over the last couple of years, no one says that anymore, right? Like no one says, yep, no tornado will ever come to where I live. So then you need to take this and you say, I've identified my risks. Now what? And that gets into being able to turn what you've learned into something useful. So like, what are the things that you need to do? And so this is the second part of what I would say is where a lot of organizations get in trouble. They've come up with like a bajillion things that are risks to their organization. And they're like, oh my goodness, where do I start? And so what we always recommend when we're going into the workshop is pick a couple things, maybe even just one, and have it be something that's really small. And then what you're going to do is that we would have you do a business impact analysis. Now everybody goes, oh man, business impact analysis, that sounds really overwhelming. So I would just go ahead and just share with you what it is. So a business impact analysis predicts the consequences of disruption of a business, your business, function, and process, and gathers information needed to develop recovery strategies. What does that sound like? Oh, wait, let's see. Business disruption. How many people are doing business disruption scenarios? So we're all familiar with business continuity. We're all familiar with disaster recovery. We're all familiar with incident response. But how many of you have done a business impact analysis? What happens if the power goes out? So, Chris, I'll ask you, I mean, you probably run into this in peer group. Like, how many times do you have conversations around, like, if the power's out for 2 hours, does everybody go home? You have
Right.
a predefined.
And what's interesting here is I think that if you don't think about this ahead of time, it's always reactive to the point of, okay, all right, powering out, everyone's sitting here, there's nothing to do. What's next? Like you said, is there what's the threshold? If you
Right,
haven't done a business impact analysis, does that mean 5 minutes? Does that mean an hour? Does that mean 5 hours? And it could be different from business to business. It's not the same canned answer for every business. You have to really think about what that is.
right,
I want to go back and say something like I think you're absolutely right. Like when you look at that, a business impact analysis sounds overwhelming. It sounds
right,
massive, but like you said, I think there's like a workout. There's kind of like using a muscle that you haven't used before, and it's just a matter of
right,
that practice. Pick one scenario, go through it. Yeah, power. That's great. Power goes out. What does that mean? Your business. How much is that impacted? How many people are there? How many people can't work? Is it an hour? Can you not respond to calls? What are the thresholds? Once you work that out, then it's easy. It's like, oh, okay, now we've did that. Now let's go through another scenario. What if this happens? Right? Would you
right.
agree that it kind of there's a bit of momentum behind this, and you have to just start somewhere? Would you agree with that?
Right, and you can turn into a rabbit hole, right? So the last thing you want is to end up like, all the way down in the depths of despair and you've done absolutely nothing because you're now paralyzed. But what's interesting about this is if we just use the simplicity of power outage, let's assume for a minute that we work out of the same office. There are 10 of us, we all work there, and we've never had a power outage ever. But we know power outages are common all over the country and that they can happen to anybody for any number of reasons. I'll give you an example. Back in the day, when I was working in construction management, we had someone drive down our street and hit a power pole, and they popped like three transformers. So it didn't just do one; it was like a domino effect. And the MSP at the time and I had been recommending to my employer, like it would be a really good idea to have, a generator in the event that we have power disruption. And it just kind of continued, and it was
Mm.
like, well, we really don't have power outages that often, and so on and so forth. Well, what would have likely been, a couple hours of power outage ended up being an entire day. Like at one point, I think it was like 2 or 3 hours into this, once we kind of understood the situation, we were all sent home, right? Guess
Mm.
what the next day conversation was? We're getting a generator. And this generator is going to we're going to have redundant options, and like we'll be able to like withstand, the next apocalypse, because this can't happen. Like we can't be in that. Duration of disruption is a big deal. And so I recommend to anybody that's, considering the risk management workshop, regardless of what scenario you want to bring to the table for the workshop, or even just for your own benefit, is do an exercise that's almost trivial in its very nature. Power's out. So if we go
Mhm.
further than sending people home, what's the next step? What if now you can't come back tomorrow or the next day? Now what? Those are scenarios that are actually real. Like we remember the Joplin tornado that went through Joplin, Missouri, and like they came back to buildings non-existent. Like things are no longer running. Things that are on-prem are no longer accessible, at least for the foreseeable future. So then you go through the exercise, you do the business impact analysis, and you produce the report, and you start realizing, like, hey, there are some things that we actually need to do for our company. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of see, like, we talked about it a little bit, but let's talk about some of these other ones. Like, what happens if the data is corrupted? So we can do some of these. Are relatively straightforward. They're not so complex as like, what happens if I can't get my data back in 24 hours? What if it's 48 hours? I'll use the example. I hate using this because I think it's been a little bit overdone, but I'll say it anyways. Remember that company something strike that had the crazy,
Mm.
like, in order to come back online, we have to put people in front of your workstations. So, Chris, I think you'll find this really interesting. I asked this question. I was on a panel a couple
Mm.
weeks ago. I asked this question to the audience because they're like, would you like to add some color to the said vendor? And I'm like, yeah, I got color to add to this. Like, what if this was one of the vendors that you use with your clients right now? What would you do if you suddenly found yourself in a situation where every single endpoint you have under management now requires one of your employees to sit in front of that asset to bring it back to life? It was dead silent. No one said anything. And I was like, whoops, maybe I asked a question that was either inappropriate or culturally inappropriate or any number of things inappropriate, but it was quiet. And I think there was this, it was registering like, hey, we're not, just because we don't use big vendor products or that we don't use a product that's, say, gonna have this happen to them specifically, doesn't mean something like this isn't gonna happen. And that's what brings us into the dashboard of like, how do you measure for success with this? And I would say I've left a lot of the tooling that you kind of need to go through. We've talked about it, but during the workshop we'll provide you with these worksheets that allow you to plug in things like, what are the scenarios that we're going to use? How do I figure out what my risk appetite is? And I think what's really interesting about this is, as the exercise progresses, one of the things that's really important that you're going to find out about yourself and about your staff and about the company is that you have to get to where, as an organization, you're all on the same page with what your risk appetite actually is. And so when we get further into the workshops, so 2, 3, 4, and 5, you start to use the information that you've built out during this module to really understand, okay, well, what are my clients' risk appetites? And what if their risk appetite has a number level that's in that high sixes or sevens, and I'm at a tolerance of like 3? Well, I would suspect that the clients that you have, if their risk appetite doesn't line up with your risk appetite, that mismatch over time is going to be you losing sleep as if they were your company, because you can only do so much to protect the things that you are willing to get effort and responsibility, shared responsibility from your clients. So, Chris, like, have you guys, I mean, you do the peer group stuff too. Like, this
Oh,
seems like an
yeah.
area where we should all be doing it.
Well, and sometimes we go through these and it's like, well, duh, but there's a reality behind it. I think what's striking to me even more than that, like you said, is the mismatch between your risk tolerance and the client's. I think what's even more insidious, ooh, there's a big word. I like that. That's a 10-cent word, upgraded. But I think what's more insidious is when the client's perceived risk in actual risk is different than what the reality of their actual
Sure.
risk is. Like, just that disconnect of, well, I hired you, you're a service provider, you're going to take care of all these things. My
Oh, the
risk just went
assumed.
assume yeah, my risk went from a 9 or a 10 to 1 or 2, when it's like, wait a minute, we've only addressed things to get you to a 7 or 8. But that difference in that gap between their assumed risk
Right.
posture and their actual, and without these conversations and these exercises, boy, that's what scares me. That's what keep me up at night.
That's the responsibility matrix, I think, that comes into play too. So like, if I take 10 things that I think all companies should have, and the company that I'm providing the services to needs me to pull that off, and because I'm an MSP and I provide IT services, there's a good chance that many of the things on that list are assumed that I'm already doing. But hypothetically speaking, we put in an EDR, a SIM tool, the firewalls, all those things, and an alert goes off, right? And you need to make a decision around, who are we going to inform at the client? Well, who has acknowledged and is responsible at the client level? Because if this happens when it's an actual event, it's too late to identify who that is. It's going to be like, oh, so and so didn't answer the phone. So I called the second and the third person. Now 25 minutes have gone by, and whatever event's taking place is continuing to progress. And there's nothing you can do about it because you didn't establish any sort of critical communication path to get the right person on the phone to do something about it. And I think that's where they also start going, oh, wait a second. You mean I have to come to the table too? And so it's easy to sometimes do this with ourselves, but we often do this already with our clients and allow them to assume because we don't actually want to have the conversation. I'd
Yeah.
rather have you assume I'm doing it than have to explain to you how we're not.
Oh, oh, wow. There's a slippery slope right there.
It
But it's
is. I
so
shouldn't have
common.
said that.
No, but it's great to say it. I mean, that's why we have these topics on the show and why we talk about these things. Because one of the things we really talk about all the time is what can you do now? Rex closes out the show. What are you going to do tomorrow to make your business better? And I think
Yeah.
these are the kind of things. And sometimes we're not aware. I think there's still partners, whether it's peer group members or partners that maybe take a course, like, oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
That's fine. Great. Now that you have, do it, instead of like, oh, I'll get to, well, no, what are you going to do today? What is your shared responsibility? What are you responsible for? How are you going to address that? So no, I'm glad you're
Right.
saying these kind of things. Uh,
So we're talking about sort of the uniqueness of now what you have. And the thing is that you should have this dashboard for yourself, for your clients. And obviously that's where we get into later modules where we talk about the opportunity around risk with your clients. And this isn't like, hey, your sales and account managers need to be in this because it's opportunity to sell. No, this is an opportunity to find risk in client environments. And I think what's interesting about, the first time I did this workshop, I had some eye openers, kind of had a little bit of flashback to being an MSP. And Chris, I'm imagine you can reflect on this as an MSP as well. As do you
mhm.
ever talk about the core four, your PSA, your RMM, your financial package, whatever that is, and then obviously your communication platform, 365, Google Suite. I don't care which one it is, but essentially they're your core four. So we have them as MSPs. You have them, right? And obviously your clients probably aren't running a PSA, but what are their core four? And I would argue that their core four have the same or relatively close to the same risk tolerance. And if we started with the easy ones that we both have, so what happens if I can't run payroll? My employees are going to be kind of upset. My guess is that if I asked that of any client and said, "Hey, if your payroll package doesn't work, what happens?" And so I think this gets into how you can have real conversations around risk management that are not salesy. They're not about telling somebody to buy something. It's not about convincing the employees in your own organization why you're doing this. This should be pretty self-explanatory. Like, hey, I want to ensure that when we have bad things happen, at the very least, you are taken care of, your well-being's taken care of, the emotional health, and financially, you're still getting paid. If we solve for those two things, I think you create for a real great opportunity to have really loyal employees because can they get that if they go somewhere else? And that's kind of where I would, leave the on your plate, if you will. That was the abridged version of module one, which is really about putting the tools in place, doing the homework, doing the research that says, okay, I've got data to plug into the formula so I can figure out what my risk appetite is. Once I understand what my risk appetite is, now I can measure everything that we're doing as an organization. And when I look at that safeguard, whether it's MFA or pen testing or asset inventory, what's my level of risk tolerance? So you might be asking, like, well, how do I apply that specifically? How do I know where I'm at with that? Because obviously we can get into things like vulnerability management. It's a little bit easier because you get a score that's given to you anyways. Think about like asset inventory. If asset inventory and all of your assets have critical sensitive data on them, then you probably are going to live in a space that says 60% of asset inventory being complete, probably outside of my risk appetite. But if my asset inventory for sensitive data or critical assets is at 85, 90%, maybe that's living within my appetite. So the premise of it is like, don't try and make everything in there perfect out of the gate. It's a starting point to know what you want to get to and move the needle as you can. So that would be kind of how I would envision tackling this as we go through the 5 modules. And obviously, after this first one, if I was to just tease up what would come in module 2, the first thing that we would do is we would start talking through here are the 7 categories of risk. And so, obviously, we've done the abridged version. So when we do this for the academy, we'll spend significantly more time. I shouldn't say significantly more time. We'll spend
Mhm.
about an additional 15 to 20 minutes actually interacting and trying to help get them plugging this data in so that they have something meaningful when we go through the additional modules.
And that's where I wanna put a plug in for, we kinda talk a little bit about within Academy, the instructor-led course and the peer groups, and there's a little bit of a power of what we call cohort learning, right? And that cohort learning, really one of the big impacts is just how do we learn? And learning in small groups, reinforces what we retain and remember. And also we really design these to be very pragmatic, practical, hands-on. What do you walk away from it with? And it is amazing how much easier when you are doing this with other people, you get additional perspectives maybe you didn't have. You get additional ideas from experiences and how to solve, how you want things to look. Um, and I like the idea of in this, course of taking the time to not just say, "Oh, yeah, this is something you should do, go think about it," but actually doing some of that right there, to like you said, walking out with something practical that you can use and implement is a key component, is it not?
Absolutely, and I think without things like an academy or a classroom environment where you have peers in there also going through this, I think it's easy to live in self doubt and alone, right? So I always say
Mhm.
that cybersecurity is either an adventure or a nightmare. If you go this alone, it will become a nightmare at some point in time. We all have been there, right? Losing sleep at night, not sure if what I implemented is good enough or will get me to tomorrow where I can improve the maturity level so that we continue to raise the bar. The adventure is when I share my challenges with others who are going through the same thing. This isn't new. Cybersecurity didn't just like show up out of a Cracker Jacks box yesterday and said, "Hey, look, prize isn't what you thought it was going to be. Good luck," right? So you do things like Academy, you attend events like PAX 8 Beyond, ChannelCon, events where the primary focus is about raising the bar so that you can be successful, but not just these aren't one-on-one coaching sessions. This is an actual class environment or a room where there are peers in there that also share the same desire to mature their organization. So I think that's
Mhm.
what makes this so different from what you see in the on-demand learning. On-demand learning is great when you've been like 3 of us went through the live class. I have 5 other people that have no idea why we speak a different language than they do. And we always giggle because we have inside jokes that they don't have. Like, let them have that after in order to keep the
Mhm.
momentum
Mhm.
because we can't do live all the time. But again, we all can say this. We know that when we came back from COVID and got to spend quality time with other people, that's pretty much how we were designed. We were not designed to live behind the Zoom screen for most of our careers.
Mhm. I just, and I think that, what are they? Oh, the high tide raises all boats, and kind of it takes a village, and I just think that you hit it. I think we doing this ourselves. It's not that we're not smart enough or capable of, and we've got resources. I can read this and figure it out,
Sure.
but but why? If we can, accelerate that path to success or to implement something, by doing it in a group or doing it with others, I think that's powerful. What you said is, the self-doubt. There's a lot of things about trying to do this all on our own, and I don't think it's realistic to expect we're gonna get as far or complete things. Now, um you talked about, like, kinda going through these exercises, and you kind of provide some of these tools or the framework, the dashboard and things like that. Um, if we could go back, Willis, do you mind throwing into the bus here? If you can go back, a slide. Um, so I like that last one, risk is subjective.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about, like, I mean, just uh, some experiences where you take the same asset management or data loss, whatever it is, and can you give us an example of that perception of risk has a different, looking at it through
Sure.
different lens?
Yeah, so I think one of the easiest ones to look at it through would be getting into things like uh, patch management is an easy one, I think, to look at through two different lenses. So if you have servers that are just handling things like Active Directory and maybe some basic configs for managing your organization, you're probably not needing to back that up, every 15 minutes, right? Because the data loss is not changing at a rate that's very rapid. And so we're saying essentially that the things that need to be protected and backed up, the level to which we need to have that incremental time is going to be different across different assets. And one of the common mistakes you see is like, well, we just back up everything all the time. Well, I can get really expensive really fast. I don't care how cheap data's gotten. It hasn't gotten down to free. So I think that's one of the areas that you can see an easy shift. The other one is in the production space. So like if I have production servers that you, Chris, need to access and you're my customer, then my ability to have downtime on that server is far lower than a server that sits behind my firewall and is just for internal consumption. So I have to do things proactively so that when I do patch that production server, it's not going to go offline. So the risk is subjective in that, like, hey, if I've got custom homegrown software, I don't care how important that patch of that server is. My risk might be more the criticality of it going down because of the proprietary software might be greater than actually running or having it be patched current, right? So those are things that you have to weigh, whether it's legacy or current infrastructure. You can't just walk in and say, oh, we patch everything all the time just because that's best practice. So this gets into that whole, it's subjective in that you have to look at it through the lens of how does this impact my company if this goes sideways?
Hmm.
We used to do it, right? If you go back in the day, if you remember, we used to say like, we only patch servers if something's not working right.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't.
Wha-
Production servers were not on auto patch management. We were like, no, because heaven
No.
forbid a patch get issued. And as recent as things like Print Nightmare, we've seen that there is still this desire to go, hey, I'll patch this at a minimum 2 weeks after it's been released, just to make sure that there aren't any quirks out there impacting my update to my own environment. You see this with
There's
the Apple one. Just I'll give you this one, the Apple iOS. We are all excited, new phone. Did you see what they also released? It said, make sure that you do a full backup of your phone before updating to 16,
oh.
in case you have anything
Hmm.
important on your phone.
And
But I mean,
is
I'd
that
recommend that to anybody.
but for it to be that explicit, I mean, we always kind of joke about why are things like that written? Because some things happen. Why do you need to tell me in an iron that don't wear the clothes that you're ironing while you're ironing, right? Things like that.
Yeah,
So
I don't know if I agree with that one, but yeah, I could see where you might get to that conclusion.
yeah, but usually it said that, but to have it that explicit, uh,
Right.
you know, that's problematic. Well, let's
In
okay.
case of
So
emergency.
There's been somebody wrote that because there was somebody knows somebody that anyway. So I think this is phenomenal, and I think it again very practical, very hands on. So tell us a little bit about. Let's bring up the slide. Let's talk a little bit about the course. Then when it's the
Sure.
next opportunity for it.
So we're kicking off with your team in November. If you happen to be at EMEACon in London for ChannelCon, we are doing the risk management course there. Um, I'm sure we'll be doing it in other places as well around the globe. But for this particular course, as it was explained to me, is that we're going to do this in probably a 4 or 5 part series. And it's probably going to be a little bit different than the traditional way that we've been doing it at CompTIA, because I think for the live and for the later on demand versions of this, we want to make sure that there's good bite-sized chunks that you can work on it, go away and come back. And so the first two modules I think are probably the two of the most important, at least for me, because those really set the stage for building out your tools and ensuring that the process or the exercise of identifying and setting the bar for your risk appetite are being done. And then being able to do that across your assets and doing so in such a way that says, I have it also strategized around risk categories, because not all risk is created equally. And some of those risks, while the probability might not be that high of happening to you, I think of things like supply chain risk. Remember COVID? That had a huge impact, and we thought that was pretty bad. And then what happened? Oh yeah, we
Yeah.
had a ship get stuck in the Suez Canal, right? Like, it got worse. So, how do you plan for that? And so I think that will also help then when having conversations, to what you said earlier, Chris, about, how do you talk to a client that says, yeah, I don't really think I have anything worth taking, or I don't believe my risk is, my risk appetite's a 9, and then they find out that it's actually a 3. It's because we haven't had these conversations with them. And I think that's really what you're going to find as you go into the latter part of the series, that we're going to really start playing out some of that scenario, the conversation that says, how do you get them to be open and talk about these things? And so, you can leave the series at any point in time. I think after you've gotten through the first one and probably be successful at using some of this stuff, you're probably already doing it. The question is, how deep have you gone? Is it measurable and repeatable? Because I think that's where this becomes most valuable. We talk about security risk assessments. That's a common thing that we do in the MSP space, right? We run somebody's tool, we find out what the vulnerabilities are, we show them to the client how bad it really is and how they need to patch stuff. They're like, why do I need to patch it? Everything's working. But if you look at it through the lens of business impact analysis, now you're getting into the why are we patching, even if it's not just because of security issues, right? Bugs and features aren't necessarily security risk until they are, but they may cause undesired results when you're trying to use the product or service. And so there's reasons beyond just security for maintaining that clean house environment. So I think that kind of sums it up, is that it's a progressive process through building blocks on risk management that start with the tools and understanding of risk, and then building on how to be tactical and strategic with the way in which you go about doing risk management.
And I think it also addresses a couple things. A lot of times partners like, I know I've got this. I know, I need to do this, but I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do next. And I think this gives a great do this. Here's the next
Right.
step. Every step, in the right direction is going to help, like you said, improve your business, improve your posture. Um, and so I think the other thing I think it does is it's kind of like, when else do you do it? The 12th of never is my favorite date to schedule things. My calendar for the 12th of never is packed full. We always have good intentions. We'll get to that. I'll do that when I have time. It's when we make time is when it happens. So, having this a course like this, say, okay, right now we're going to meet on Tuesdays, and we're going to meet at this time, and we're going to focus on this. We're going to walk you through how and what to do next. And you're going to block out the time, and this is what you're going to do to get through it and to help you get to a better spot. I love that part. Now, um, Chris, this is really helpful. I want to kind of, as we kind of come to the end of the time here, is there anything else you want to add or say or talk about as we kind of wind down?
Sure. As we were talking before, that this is a workshop series. There are obviously going to be others that you guys put out there that are around cybersecurity, and you guys have been, gracious enough to include me in some of those conversations. And I think that some of the things that we're seeing with Pax8 and other vendors is that there's a lot to be desired about building content around something that creates a commonality amongst MSPs. And so we're seeing a huge push to say, how can we align our cybersecurity training academies or learning paths with the trust mark? And so if you're an MSP and you're interested in knowing what the trust mark is about and how that might help you as you're going through things like the risk management workshop or other security courses being offered by Pax8 or other vendors that you work with, just Google the CompTIA Cybersecurity Trust Mark. It will pop right up, and there's a interest form that you can fill out. It asks for a lot of information like name and email address. We're pretty specific. So the reason why I bring that up is if you're not aligning your organization to a set of standards, that would be step one, because anything that you're doing with cybersecurity education, it gives you something to track it against. So if you pick NIST CSF version 2, or you want to do CIS top 18, which I know PAX 8 does a CIS top 18 course, I've sat in on it. It makes it easier. It gives you direction without having to do this yourself. It's ironic. I talk about this periodically. I'll give this illustration. Remember when you were a kid, Chris, and you were building the Lego Death Star, and you skipped a page of instructions because they were stuck together, and you found yourself having to go back and redo several pages of Legos, which meant you had to undo, which means they were no longer in the packaging that was numbered 1 through bajillion, to get the Death Star back on track, right? CIS
Worst 3
top
months
18,
of my life.
Yeah. See? CIS top 18 as an example, or the trust mark. You're working through that and you skipped page 2. Guess what? It doesn't mean start over. It means that you still can go back and add that stuff in, but at least you have a framework that gives you direction and you can follow it as closely or as loosely as you want. It's always going to be there.
Perfect. Love it. Great words. Chris, really appreciate. I always enjoy talking to you, and appreciate your time being here. Again, would really encourage people to check out the Trustmark and to connect with you for that program, and also check out this course, Navigating Risk. It's so important, and there's so many benefits and reasons you should do this. And with the subscription model to the instructor-led courses through PAX 8 Academy, it makes it very easy and accessible. So I'd really encourage you to check this out. But thank you for your time, Chris. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, guys.
And so now let's move on to sales piece. All right, let's try that again. Let's move on to sales pitch. On to Keith.
As a baseball coach, I needed to look after the safety of my players. As their coach, I was responsible for their physical safety, their health, and the facility safety, making sure they had the proper equipment to protect themselves, protect their bodies. They had to have plenty of hydration, water, Gatorade. They needed to have first aid available. And I also had to inspect the field, check to make sure it was playable and safe, both for my players and any teams that we were hosting. If any of those risked my players, we had to determine if the practice or the game would have to be postponed or even played, or what would need to be done to reduce that risk to those players. Risk management for salespeople, whether you're a principal-led sales or you have a dedicated salesperson, is a reality. Ever-changing market conditions, the way our prospects and our clients buy from us, and competition are a few examples which make sales dynamic. Sales risk is centered on proactively identifying and mitigating pitfalls that may impede sales success. Let's touch all the bases on common pitfalls in sales, and I'll even provide some ideas on how to avoid them in sales for our IT services business. 1. Insufficient training and underdeveloped sales skills. We need to mitigate this by having sales training programs to enhance sales teams' competencies. Weekly in-house sales meetings, one-on-ones with our sales employees to help them with this, to role play. 2. Overlooking our competition. Here's a big one. Neglecting to monitor the changes in the tech market can lead the sales teams into traps that are set by our competition. We need to mitigate this by having a log of all your competitors. What do they do well? A SWOT analysis. If you're not familiar with that, that's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats on our competitors. Know their strengths, know their weaknesses, implement a plan to actually flip the script and set traps for them. 3. Knowing who our buyers are. Who's our target industry, first and foremost? And who are the people inside that industry that we need to talk to? Sales is a relationship based on role play between buyers and salesperson. Far too often, salespeople are playing the wrong parts. They're acting like the sellers when we should be really thinking about the buyers. We want to mitigate this by knowing who the buyers are in our target client industry, know how their job is measured, and what their biggest challenges are. 4, ignoring or not acquiring client feedback. Not knowing what problems we solve for our target client. What's the 2 to 3 problems that they have? Knowing what results our solutions create. So we don't fall into that commodity trap and we're talking about how great our people are, how great our service is, and all the fantastic tools that we sell. We need to mitigate this by talking to our existing clients. Get feedback from them on how you've helped them. Be able to turn this information into stories to be able to articulate your value and have a conversation with people. Don't just write this stuff down. Role play it. Consistently add this topic to your sales meetings. Getting new clients is hard. Risk management can positively impact sales teams' performance by minimizing uncertainties, avoiding traps that are set by your competition, capitalizing on opportunities, and maximizing revenue generation. So, be a coach and get your team in the best condition and have the right equipment for them to win, and be protected on the playing field of sales.
Play ball!
Thank you, Keith. Another episode well done. Appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for watching. Be sure to check us out next week. We'll be talking all about Paxate Academy and filling you in on what the great resource it has, like on-demand courses, instructor-led courses, peer groups, and coaching. And we will also be joined by Amanda Glidden on next week's episode. That'll be a lot of fun. So please be sure to check it out. Remember, we're live every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Mountain Time and on demand always. And don't forget to subscribe and like us on the YouTube channel. Ask yourself, what are you going to do differently tomorrow to improve your business? Bye.